Okay, we've got over 3 hours done, 3 parts, 3 video lectures, and 1.5 pages gone through, with 4.5 more pages to go. Oh man, it's going to be a late night. And so we'll see. But that's how important I believe this is. So I hope at least one person appreciates this. Alright, so last day's warning to LDS Mormons from one of your own before April General Conference 2018, Part 4. I'm Travis Wayne Goodsell, and to go over the previous lectures in summary. Lecture 1, Book of Mormon good exposes bad. Second lecture, last day signs not revealed by the prophets. And then 3, our government has collapsed. And I found out who gave me the banana bread, and I'll discuss the background behind that, but it applies to the next segment, so I don't know if it'll be covered in this first segment here. But with the collapse of government, I need to emphasize, where were the prophets to warn us about fascism? Back in the Red Scare days, the prophets were getting up in General Conference and saying, be wary of communism, communism bad. But not once can I find anywhere where any prophet at the pulpit during General Conference spoke out against fascism. Communism, yeah, they've done that. Fascism, nope. In fact, when you realize that the Republican Party dominates Utah, and that the Republican Party dominates the first presidency in the Quorum of the 12, you then start to wonder. And then, as I'm going to be explaining or exposing, you'll understand why that's the case. And that's a sad state of affairs for the church. Because with the collapse of the government, that is symbolized by the total solar eclipse that we had in August. And so the lunar eclipse that we had at the end of January, that is the symbol for the collapse of the church. Now, as Mormons, if you're still listening to me, you're going to find that extremely hard to believe and accept, because you have been raised, never go against the leaders. They will never lead you astray. You know, the 14 fundamentals from President Benson. And those 14 fundamentals are all faulty. I've posted on that specific talk of his, going over each and every single one of the 14 fundamentals, exposing the error that they are. So, yeah, you go to my website for that. I'm not going to bring it up in this video. It's going to take forever to go through what I've written out last night. So, what we're going over now is the shell game and then I'll get into how do you identify a corrupt religion and talk about the banana bread story. Alright, shell game. I served my mission in New York, New York, and while with my companion at the time in Manhattan, we came across a crowd of people. And as we started walking by, the crowd slowly separated to allow us to see what was in the center of the crowd. I thought that was strange enough as it was, that they were all in harmony, making a break in the crowd for us to see that it was a shell game that was taking place. And the experience has taught me a valuable lesson on the tactics of corrupt individuals. And this involves conspiracy, because it's more than one person involved, not just one person doing bad things. This is a group of people planning and orchestrating a con on other people. And so yeah, everybody in that group was in on the con, and that's part of the con. You have a person who moves around the shells on the box on a little stand that he can collapse instantly and walk away with, and you have somebody who's a big talker trying to encourage people to play the game and give $10, it was back then, to play the game, and he was talking it up. Who can do it? Who can beat the shell guy and find the ball under which shell? And then you had somebody in the crowd who would yell out, "Don't do it, it's a trap, it's a con, you'll just lose your money, don't play." You know, the one who was warning about the game. He was in on the con. And then you had another person who was in on the con, but because you didn't see them all gathered together at once, you just happened to walk by and there they are. You know, they had onlookers, or not, scouts, I guess you'll call them, who were watching for people who were coming by, and they would alert the crowd, they're coming, quick, get in your positions. And so then you had one person in that group who would have $10, and he may have $20, so that he could play twice, depending on the need to convince the people who were passing by, which was us at the time. He was the sucker, and he'd put down his $10. I can do it, I know exactly where the ball will be. And you know, the guy moves the shells around, and then he makes his guess, and he's obviously wrong, and he gets upset and frustrated. No, it had to have been there, let me try that again. And so he puts down another 10, depending on how quickly we or anybody else who walks by would respond. And so we would see this guy constantly lose. And the big talker, who's talking it up and is basically the showman for the game, is the one who collects the money. Then the rest of the people in the crowd are supposed to be curious onlookers. they're supposed to be unaffiliated with the actual game itself, and so what the game is designed to do is to prey on whichever natural human emotional response will convince you to play the game. If you're a person who thinks, oh, a game, that sounds like fun, I want to try, then yeah, you don't really need anybody else in the crowd, you just need the guy doing the shells. If you're the type of person who gives in to peer pressure or challenges you that you can't do it, then that's where the money taker guy who is the big talker comes into play. He plays on that part of your human nature, and then you have the side of human nature that wants to be rebellious or defiant of any warning that is given, and so that's where the guy who gives out the warning voice comes into play. He gets those who are fooled by not trusting and believing in warning voices, and that I am a warning voice in this situation, but this is not a con, people. This is serious. So if that's not your human nature or if that is your human nature to disregard warning voices, which seems to be the tendency, as I pointed out regarding David O. McKay's order to the elders of the church in Priesthood General Conference back in '66, and they did nothing. That seems to be the status quo for Mormons generally, which would explain why Mormons are under condemnation still for not treating the Book of Mormon seriously, as indicated in the Doctrine and Covenants. And so the sucker preys upon that part of human nature that says, oh, that guy's a dummy, I knew exactly where the ball was, I can find it, and then you use your arrogance and pride to go in and get fooled into playing the game. So you see, we also have the curious onlookers. They prey on the part of human nature that tells us we need to belong to a group or an organization, that we need to be a part of whatever other people are doing, whatever the popular thing is at the moment, that we need to get involved in and do. And you've seen it in our culture time and time again. The fidget spinners were the latest craze, and then they started blowing up and catching fire, and so that's how the shell game works. It's a con game. Nobody is ever supposed to really win it. If you replicate it in your own personal life, then yeah, there's no con involved, unless you know how the box has a secret little trap door that he drops the ball into, or whatever magician trick is used for the con. Yeah, that's the con game, and it's part of the get rich quick promises. There are all sorts of get rich quick schemes that are out there in the world, and Utah is the most vulnerable for get rich quick schemes. I've been confronted by numerous people trying to get me involved in a pyramid scheme, in a make big bucks scheme, all that types of stuff, and I keep saying no, and they keep trying to use all these different tactics on me. Don't you want to support your family? Don't you want to live a good life? When I already talked about Lucifer's tactics that are exposed in the Book of Mormon. Nobody should be falling for those. You know, that the get-rich-quick scheme is just like gambling. That's a get-rich-quick con. With gambling, the poor are victimized because the poor often will play the lotto, the lottery, scratch cards. They'll go to Vegas, Wendover, or other gambling casinos, and or they'll go online to the gambling places online now, and the Bitcoin, the electric currency, or whatever it is, that's a gambling. That's all part of a con job. It's a con economic system. It's the bubble and burst principle. You know, right now everybody's buying it, and so it's building up, and people are able to get rich. But if you don't pull out, you're going to lose everything, and that's where they get you, is because the people in control set the time of when they burst the bubble and withdraw their funding and thus collapse everything else. That's how the stock market works. The stock market is the gambling institution for the rich. You know, they allow the poor to enter the stock market, but the poor aren't able to get as much stock as the rich are. And that's what the rich do, is they build up the bubble and then they burst it. And we're witnesses of that with the Trump presidency. He kept giving money to the rich corporations. The rich corporations then laundered that money into the stock market in their own businesses and increased their stock profits, and then boom, they sell it, and the stock market crashes. And that's what it's been doing lately, is it's crashing. And that's how you make more and more money, is that if you're the one who's able to pull out before the crash, you then can buy low and sell high. And that's why it's all a con, is because the rich elite are controlling the game. They determine when to crash the stock market, and then they buy up the stocks at the low price, and then they build up the stock market again until they crash. And it's this cyclical process. And this has been the tactic of the secret Gadianton robbers in these last days. It's well documented. If you're familiar with the Rothschilds, they're the family that is big time in this secret organization. They're the money, the bank of this group. And that's how they've destroyed nations, is by building up the nation's GDP or the stocks in their nation, and then they would crash it. And the nation would then be forced to sell their stocks to the Rothschilds at this low price, and then they would hire the Rothschilds to be their central banking system for their country. And thus the secret band of Gadianton in these latter days take over nation after nation after nation. You'll never guess which nation is the only nation left to not have a central bank. After 2003, as we invaded the Middle East, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq fell to a central banking system. They're now part of the central banking system. But guess which one is still holding out? North Korea. Wonder why we're putting so much pressure on them lately. So that's the shell game, and that's all a part of the economic con that's going on in our world, in our nation, and right under our noses by our own government. Okay, now we're going to discuss the indicators of a corrupt religion. The Book of Mormon exposes corrupt religions as well as corrupt governments and corrupt economies and corrupt individuals as well, or groups of individuals. The Book of Mormon is that detailed on the precepts that it covers on how to protect us from corrupt people. I'm only going to bring out a few of the main issues. One of them is that they make the poor pay. And not only do they make them pay, they do so by issuing threats of eternal damnation, for example, or even direct physical threats sometimes, where they will expel a person from their home or deny them food assistance or welfare assistance. Our United States society has a government that gives minimal assistance to the poor, and yet require charitable organizations, especially religions, to help the poor. Here in Utah, you'd be interested to know that the government of Utah does not want an individual on welfare to get any kind of outside assistance beyond what they give you, because if you do, even if it's food assistance, you're required to notify them that you've received this assistance, and they then deduct it from the amount that they give you every month. And so, as a result, you can imagine the majority of people, if not all, are lying and deceiving the government into letting them know that they're not receiving any extra help and assistance. No, not at all. But the LDS Church that is made aware of this government order will refuse to give the poor who are on government assistance any additional assistance, because they know it will cause further damage. So that creates some problems in Utah, and nobody's addressing that issue. Yeah, those are the kinds of things that a corrupt religion would also do, is threaten the poor to pay up. They also do a psychological attack in trying to make you feel guilty. Don't you love the Lord? Don't you want Him to know that you love Him? You know, those are psychological manipulations. If you remember the widow's mite that Jesus is talking about to the Pharisees, you know, it's not a matter of, oh, well, even the poor should pay. Look at this widow who's giving all she has into the coffers. You know, no, that's not what he's discussing. He is pointing out to the Pharisees, who made the law to take money from the poor, even the widows who basically have nothing, to give all they have. And Jesus is rebuking them in his discussion with the Pharisees. You know, take a look at this widow. She's given all she has, and that's more than what you give. And so that's a rebuke by Jesus over the system that they created to abuse the poor and take advantage of the poor. Because if you're paying attention to your New Testament, Jesus established an economic society where everyone was equal. And there were no rich or poor among his followers. They had a different economic system than what the Pharisees had established. Okay, and the next one is that the religious leaders are paid. The religion is supposed to be a lay ministry, especially in our church. We're supposed to be a lay ministry. So bishops and stake presidents and members do not get paid for holding church callings. And it's supposed to follow all the way up to the president of the church, who is not supposed to get paid for being the president of the church. And in corrupt religions, the poor are denied financial assistance when the leaders are getting financial assistance. And so there's a bit of hypocrisy that goes on in corrupt religions. And if the poor are not denied, they're only given minimal subsistence, and thus they're strung out and prolonged in their misery as poor people. And that's torture. And that's worse than just outright denying them and condemning them to die in the streets. You know, this is a prolonged agony. You know, and they fill them with the false, deceptive hope that God will reward you for your sacrifice. They'll even admit that their sacrifice is greater than theirs. You know, it's all the con game. So corrupt religions are something to watch out for. Also, the money in corrupt religions goes to possessions and elaborate buildings, elaborate churches, temples, the furnishings for those buildings, and the possessions of the rich. They receive financial compensation, or they will get luxurious furnishings for their personal homes and their personal use. And whereas the poor, you know, they don't get anything to help improve their situation. And so those are three main things that corrupt religions do. And those are the things we need to watch out for in our church. And I'm going to expose that soon enough. But in the Book of Mormon, this is where I get it from. We've got the Nephi's vision of the great and abominable church, and the wealth that they accumulate over the poor, and the lavish furnishings of the synagogues, as well as their own personal lifestyles, the fancy clothes, the fancy furnishings, the lavish lifestyle with great and tremendous foods, and then King Noah, he likewise abused his authority and made himself rich on the labors of the poor. And the Zoramites, I've already discussed that. The rich went so far as to kick the poor out of the synagogues so that they couldn't worship in the synagogue at the Rameumptom to give their rote prayer. And so those are the three big examples in the Book of Mormon of warning us about corrupt religions. And you would think that as Mormons growing up, being born into the church, that we would think that our church is perfect and infallible and would never be guilty of any of these kinds of corruptions that the church of the devil would have. But let's get to it. Malachi. We'll start with him rather than Elder Iring's yearly wage. In the book of Malachi, it talks about tithing to be used for the poor. It's talking about the separation between the different types of offerings, tithing and offerings. They're separated. The tithing, he then goes on to talk about, is to be placed in the storehouse. Now you got to understand that back then the tithing had to do with the fruits of your field and the firstlings of your flock. It was not necessarily monetary. And so what you were giving would go directly to the storehouse. And the storehouse was to take care of the poor. And the poor can't pay tithing. They don't make an increase on farming or herding, shepherding, and so, you know, they aren't able to pay tithing. That's why they need the tithing of those who can pay tithing to take care of them. And that's what the storehouse was designed for, is that you pay your tithing to the storehouse, and then the church would then help the poor, make them equal with the rich. But I'm sure you guys well know, and the church advertises this directly on their website, as well as in tithing settlement. It's reminded to us, tithing goes for buildings and temples. It does not go for the poor. That's what fast offerings are for. They created something else to take care of the poor. And the big focus in the church is pay your tithing, pay your tithing, pay your tithing. If you don't pay your tithing, you're going to be burned. See, there's the threat. And the church went astray on that. In the beginning, Joseph Smith tried a economic law of consecration, and the members of the church couldn't abide by it. There was too much pride, too much greed, too much secrecy, too much corruption, and the members of the church had to then abide by the law of tithing that Joseph Smith changed it to. And then, of course, Brigham Young is the one who changed the policy around. The poor never got helped. So, that's the issue with tithing. If you hadn't heard by now, it was leaked that Elder Iring, back when he was a regular apostle, before he was upgraded into the first presidency, his paycheck stub was released and leaked to the public. And on that paycheck stub, it showed that he was making $200,000 a paycheck. So times that by 52 for 52 weeks in a year, and that's over $10 million. So a regular apostle made over $10 million a year. I wonder what he makes now as a first presidency member. You know, the church has non-profit, profit, and educational business corporations. The non-profit is supposed to be where the tithing and fast offerings go to. And yet we see that he's getting tax deductions for being a religious organization worker. And thus he's getting paid to be a religious person. So he's not lay ministry, he's paid ministry. And thus all of the apostles and prophets, all the way up to the president of the church, are getting paid in their calling, in their office. That alone should outrage everybody. You know, but people say, well, they've got to survive and live. Well, yeah. Can't they get church welfare? Isn't that how it's supposed to be done? That church welfare takes care of those? You know, I mean, $10 million a year. And yet there are poor in my ward. In fact, we even have disabled in my ward. And as a result, they aren't getting any support from our local bishop. And the leaders of the church are making $10 million a year. And the poor disabled in our ward alone are getting nothing. So, again, the Book of Mormon tells us how to identify a corrupt religion. This is not me, this is not my opinion, this is not my feelings, and I'm just being offended. No, the Book of Mormon says very clearly what to watch for, what to warn members of the church if something were to happen in our church leadership. The Book of Mormon is the check on the prophets and the leaders of the church. You know, that's why we're under condemnation for not applying the Book of Mormon in our lives. You've got to study, you've got to research. You know, as a result, the leaders of the church have gone unchecked and nobody's stopped them. Okay, so that's that paper. Alright. So, as I've talked about previously in the first lecture, looks like I need to stop and cover this on the next segment. Okay, one more thing with the economic condition. Ezekiel chapter 16 tells us exactly what the sins of Sodom were. And if you're thinking it's going to list homosexuality, nope, not in the list. Homosexuality was not considered the sin of Sodom. Pride, haughtiness were among those in the list. But the big one that was talked about in several different ways was denying substance to the poor. That was the great big sin of Sodom. And they were prosperous, wealthy people, and refused to give their substance to the poor. That is the big sin that God is concerned with. If you are not taking care of the poor, if you are not taking care of your neighbor, if you are not taking care of your brother and sister, if you're not taking care of his children, you're in big trouble, especially when you're in a position of religious leadership. So, yeah, there you have it. As you can see, I'm calling out the LDS Mormon prophets. They are in violation of the Book of Mormon. They are in violation of the laws of God. And that's not my opinion. This is not my feelings or my offended, tender mercies. This is straight from the Book of Mormon. It says it very clearly that this is what corrupt church leaders do, and you need to stand up and rise up against them and get rid of them, because it's going to otherwise end up in war and bloodshed to try to get rid of them, especially when the religious leader holds government sway, either as a government leader in a theocracy or has direct influence on the government leaders themselves. So there's a big problem there. So I've pointed out to you that the prophets are not warning us of the signs that have occurred in fulfillment of Scripture. The prophets have not warned us of the upcoming destruction that is about to happen. The family proclamation says you better be good in the family and have one man, one woman in a household, because otherwise there will be dangers coming. But it does not tell anything specific about, hey, stay away from fascism, knock it down, keep it out of government. It's going to kill everybody and depopulate the world. They're not doing that. And they're changing the doctrines in conference. I mentioned Elder Pullman and that scandal, and how the leaders of the church now go to Mormon apologists who tell them the Mormon lies rather than the true doctrine that comes straight from the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is the official doctrine of the church. You can disagree with it as being historically accurate and archaeologically accurate, but in regards to its precepts, I've not found anybody yet who can argue against them. Nobody even talks about them. There are people who try to say, well, it's racist and sexist, and there might be some truth to that, but it's hard-pressed when you get to the actual spoken precepts that the Book of Mormon talks about and warns of. And then you've got the leaders of the church denying substance to the poor, which is the sin of Sodom. Sodom was destroyed because they didn't take care of the poor. That's how all nations collapse. They don't take care of the poor. You take care of the poor, period. Alright. Okay. Now, the church has been covering up church history. That's another problem. You can't cover things up. You can't deceive people. You can't lie to people as part of your cover-up. You can't do that. I was just going to talk about section 121 of the Doctrine and Covenants, but I think it's important that we bring it up and read exactly what it warns priesthood leaders about. And it is applicable to anybody, but it's specifically talking to priesthood leaders. It's the many are called, but few are frozen, if you remember your seminary days. And okay. Alright, behold, there are many called, but few are chosen. And why are they not chosen? This was in verse 34 is where we start. Because their hearts are set so much upon the things of this world. So, it's possessions. It's money. That's the things of the world. And they aspire to the honors of men. You'd be interested to know how many of our prophets have been honored with awards, medals, and honorary titles, and buildings in their name while they're living. It's one thing to do it after they're dead and gone. It's another thing to do it while they're living. That they do not learn this one lesson, that the rights of the priesthood are inseparably connected with the powers of heaven, and that the powers of heaven cannot be controlled nor handled only upon the principles of righteousness. That they may be conferred upon us, it is true, but when we undertake to cover our sins, cover-ups, or to gratify our pride, our vain ambition, or to exercise control or dominion or compulsion upon the souls of the children of men in any degree of unrighteousness. So no threats, no guilt trips, no psychological manipulations. All of that is exercising unrighteous control, dominion, compulsion upon other people. And here's what happens to these wicked people, these wicked church leaders. Behold, the heavens withdraw themselves. No revelation. Guess what I said about the prophets? They've not come out and talked about the fulfillment of the signs in the scriptures prophesied of. They've not warned us of the dangers. There has not been a single revelation over the conference pulpit since Joseph Smith. Nothing. No revelations. And why? Because the heavens withdrew themselves from the presidents of the church when Brigham Young took over. And not a single one has had a revelation since. They've had business decisions that they've made, and they pose that as revelation. That's not revelation. But also, the Spirit of the Lord is grieved. That's part of the heavens withdrawing, is you no longer have revelation from the Spirit of the Lord. And when it is withdrawn, amen to the priesthood, or the authority, not the power, the authority of that man. It'd be interesting to know that women were given the priesthood as well by Joseph Smith in the Relief Society session in 1843. Brigham Young took that away from the women. So there you have it. There's the explanation. I've pointed out several of the corruptions of the leaders of the church, the prophets, and I've pointed out to you why they have not given us revelation, and it's because God does not accept them. He does not accept their authority. In verse 39, we have learned by sad experience that it is the nature and disposition of almost all men, as soon as they get a little authority, as they suppose, they will immediately begin to exercise unrighteous dominion. Hence, many are called, but few are chosen. So these leaders of the church believe they are chosen and called of God, but God is not revealing anything to them. That's why we are not getting the secrets revealed to us, warning us of the upcoming danger this very year. And that should infuriate everybody. No power or influence can or ought to be maintained by virtue of the priesthood, only by persuasion, long-suffering, and by gentleness and meekness, and by love unfeigned, by kindness and pure knowledge. Pure knowledge, which gets accused of being fake news, which shall greatly enlarge the soul without hypocrisy and without guile, reproving betimes with sharpness when moved upon by the Holy Ghost, and then showing forth afterwards an increase of love toward him whom thou hast reproved, lest he esteem thee to be his enemy. Blah, blah, blah. So there you have it. Oh, I was going to tell you about the banana bread story. So, let's see. Before we get into church history and the church cover-up, alright. The banana bread, I found out from my across the hall neighbor, was given to me by my ward missionary. Excuse me, I'm joking. By my ward mission leader. He is refusing to understand what I've been telling him over and over again, and he gaslights me when he did visit with one of the stake representatives during the stake visits before ward conference, and the story has to do with an issue that I had with my bishop. It wasn't an offense. I didn't leave, but I was pleading for help concerning a situation. And previous to this pleading for help, he was acknowledging his thanks for informing me of the updates. But in this situation, I got no response from him at all. And then I had emailed the stake president, warning him, or not warning him, but giving a warning that I would hope he would pass on to the new President Nelson concerning the new lesson format for this year in Priesthood and Relief Society. And the new teaching format takes us away from teaching classes. Now it's discussion groups where members of the elders, high priests, Relief Society get to share their feelings and opinions about the doctrines of the church. That's a big danger when the members of the church get to tell each other what the doctrine is supposed to be, rather than looking to the scriptures and learning what the doctrine is from the scriptures, from prophets. Because as you study the apostasy of Jesus's organization, that was one of the causes, was that people were going their own way, forming churches based upon their own opinions on and interpretations of the doctrine of the church. Like I said, there were more gospels than just the 4 we had in the New Testament. And people were writing their own gospels, attributing them to apostles and other high church authorities. And each church had their own creed or articles of faith and their own gospel. And that led to the apostasy. And that's what is happening this year by changing. We were supposed to study the life and times of Thomas S. Monson, and it would have been perfect for this year because he passed away on the second day of the year. And so that would have been a perfect tribute to make the lessons his book. But nope, not doing him. We're doing our own way. Now members of the church are going to tell their own doctrine. So what's that going to do? Each and every single ward is going to come up with their own doctrine, just like in the ancient days during the apostasy. Each church will then form their own doctrinal views, their own doctrinal interpretations. So when you move out of your ward, having established the doctrines through them, you're going to go to a different ward, and guess what? You're now going to be in opposition to their doctrinal beliefs. And you'll be persecuted for having your different views from your previous ward. Big time danger. The church couldn't have made a more wrong decision in going to this format. And so I sent a letter to my stake president asking him to deliver it to President Nelson. And time went by, and I notified my bishop in an email that the problem that I was asking for help was now done and over with, and I got an email back from him where he said he wanted to have a private conversation with me. I thought that was strange. Private conversation? Why can't you just tell me what it's about? And so I would ask. I've just had this terrible thing happen, and I'm not ready to have to deal with false accusations, because there were some other conditions that were going on, and so I was fishing to find out what he wanted to talk to me about in private, and he refused to disclose what it was about, and I was left on my own on the matter, and so I therefore politely declined to meet with him, and he instead cornered me after the ward council meeting, and proceeded to give me the guilt trip, to say, I'm very disappointed that you didn't want to meet with me. I thought you and I had a good relationship, and all those guilt trip talks and mind manipulations, and said that he was told by the stake president that I need to stop telling other people on my posts, on YouTube videos, that the Book of Mormon is the official doctrine of the church. And I couldn't, what do you say to that? You know, you have your church leader who says, don't go around telling people that the official doctrine is in the Book of Mormon. Now this was in regards to lesson number 4 for the Old Testament, which was on Adam falling. So that you have some context as to where he was coming from. The Book of Mormon says something different than the traditional Christian viewpoint as to what happened during the fall. And you got to study your Book of Mormon in order to figure this out. And you got to know how to translate a biblical Hebrew, how to identify false interpolations that were added into the New Testament. And you need to know the origin of the text of the false story comes from the Egyptian records. And all I did was advertise that, hey, this is the official doctrine of the church that I was presenting, and it comes from the Book of Mormon as you read my lesson. And so yeah, I was directly told by my bishop that the stake president ordered me to stop. And so, yeah, I've written a letter to President Nelson informing him of the abuses that are going on and that it needs to stop. He's never responded. So if he responds in conference, okay. He's not doing anything to resolve the concern. Yeah, I was told not to bother coming to church anymore. And so yeah, I sent an email to the stake president letting him know that I got the message plain and clear that I was no longer welcome in the church, and that because I won't deny the Book of Mormon as the official church doctrine of the LDS Church, I will abide by their orders not to come to church anymore. And then the bishop responded with an email and threw on the guilt trip, you know, and the same situation. I thought we were friends. I was deeply hurt, and I think you're mentally ill and that you need to be on medication. He put that. Abinadi. You guys familiar with Abinadi? He was said that because he was preaching against the corruption of King Noah and his priests, teaching the people to be corrupt, that therefore he was a threat to the king and the kingdom, and he was mad, which not angry mad, but insane mad. That's what corrupt people do. They label the people who tell them that they are committing sin, that they're the ones who are the threat, and that they are mentally ill. That's the human nature pattern. And my bishop did it right there in an email. And it's documented, you know, like the Stormy Daniels videotape that she's got as leverage in case Trump and anybody else continues to abuse and harass her. I've got my email. And I responded with a huge email response listing all of his corruptions revealed from his email. And so, yeah, I have posted on my website that, you know, I will not be coming to church because other people show little acts of kindness. That's not why I don't go to church. I don't go to church because I was ordered not to by my priesthood leaders, the stake president through the bishop. And until the stake president and the bishop send me a signed document indicating what they did wrong, specifically that they are in the wrong, and that what they plan to do to restore me in the church, and what or not what, but and that they will, effective immediately, resign. There can be no forgiveness. You guys need to understand, you don't give forgiveness when somebody commits sin. They have to repent. If they don't restore the damage they've caused, you can't trust them. You can't allow them to continue to commit sin. You've got to stop it. You've got to stop it and not allow the abuse to continue. And Christians don't understand what Jesus is saying in his Sermon on the Mount. He was not talking about be a punching bag. He was telling them how to win in a legal court battle if somebody abuses you. So, you got to study, you got to research. But that's the situation, and the bishop and the stake president are obviously not willing to comply. Corrupt leaders never do. They will never admit they're in the wrong, and they will expect me to come crawling back, begging forgiveness and pleading that they'll show mercy on me. That ain't gonna happen. So I don't know why other people, like the Word Mission leader, is trying to get me to come back to church, and that he doesn't understand what's really going on. And so that's the story of the banana bread. So we'll stop there, and then when we get into the next lecture part 5, we'll discuss how far back the cover-up goes, and who the chosen successor is, and how we will know who he is.